It's with great pleasure that I welcome you all here this evening on behalf of Oxford City Press to this panel discussion on a very important book, Catch Up, Developing Countries of the World Economy. I would also like to welcome you on behalf of the India Habitat Center who helped us organize this program. OUP takes great pride in presenting this important book, which is a brilliant overview of the role of developing countries as it has evolved over centuries. It's perhaps having the first to address this theme on such a wide canvas that spans both time and space. As Professor Dipankar says, this book is not written as a conventional academic monograph for specialists, but accessible to a much wider readership. It's written in a style where complex things are explained in a simple manner, making it comprehensible to concerned readers who have an interest in research. So I'm pleased to report that the book has received exciting reception and is fast flying off the shelves across the world. We have just gone for another print. We are grateful to Professor Nayyar for moderating this discussion and to Professor Romila, Thapar, Professor Bhaduri, and Professor Gupta to be panelists. It's not very often you see such an eminent gathering, and we're delighted to be part of it. We look forward to a stimulating discussion. Let me also express my gratitude to Professor Deepak, firstly for publishing with us and for his wonderful support in organizing this event. Finally, permit me to mention my appreciation to my colleagues, especially Preeti Chaturvedi, Romila, Asha Joseph, and Thapar, and Nelly Safety for helping us organizing this event. Professors, we are indeed most grateful further to try to moving forward. Thank you.
I don't think there is any doubt that this is a very special evening, and before I invite Professor Deepak, I'll just kind of get the formality out of the way. It's a special evening not only because we are here to celebrate the publication of a very important book, but I think if you can see the panel, just all you need to say about this panel is India's most important story and cornerstones of strategists are on it. That itself, I think, makes this occasion special. Deepak to introduce the book.
Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to see all of you here. There is no greater joy for authors than finding readers, and no greater joy for speakers than finding listeners. But I will not burden you with a long statement. I just want to introduce my book in the form of what could be best described as a teaser. For those standing at the back, there are a few chairs up front. The object of my book is to analyze the evolution of developing countries in the world. But with a focus on the second half of the 20th and the first decade of the 21st century. It is perhaps among the first that I know of to address this theme on such a wide spectrum that spans both time and space. May I say this and it is not about joining the list. It never began life on a first note with a public lecture at Helsinki in early 2009, which led me to reflect further on this theme and think about many unanswered questions. The idea of writing a book for the subject surfaced sometime later, and the connection of economics with history seemed an exciting prospect. Yet, it seemed an ambitious, daunting task to write a book that spans in economics about Europe. I decided to take the plunge in late 2010. Research turned out to be a journey in exploration and discovery. This book is a product of to a much wider readership, for I am convinced that economics is and should be comprehensible to concerned readers who have interest. In writing this book, I've attempted to simplify, to explain, to reach out to the reader. I sincerely hope that it would interest scholars across disciplines in the social sciences, and the composition of the people on the podium mirrors this hope, just as I hope that it might engage the book poses and endeavors to answer some unexplored, almost neglected questions. The first set of questions is about the distinction. Does the distinction between rich and poor countries go back a long time? If not, when did the countries or continents now described as the developing world begin their decline and fall? What was their significance in the world economy in terms of shares of world population and world income 500 years ago or 200 years ago? What was their share of manufacturing output in the world economy 2 centuries earlier, and how did it change during the colonial era? Did their interaction with the world economy since the mid-19th century, through trade and migration, shape their trajectories of development? The second set of questions is about the more recent past, during the period from 1950 to 2010, which is also the primary focus of the book. To what extent did rapid economic growth in developing countries, a phrase used to describe Africa, Asia excluding Japan, and Latin America including the Caribbean, since 1950 lead to a recovery in their share of world output? How did the growth in their national income and per capita income compare with that of rich countries? Did the divergence in their per capita income relative to the West come to an end, and did divergence end? Were there any changes in the nature of the world economy? What was the extent of catch-up in industrialization? Did it lead to convergence or divergence within the developing world? Was rapid economic growth associated with a decrease or an increase in poverty and inequality within countries? Now, there is another question that arises. We learn from this experience of the past 6 decades, or from the earlier past, about the future of developing countries in the world economy. Now, my book sketches an untold story addressing these questions about the overwhelming significance, mostly of Asia, but also Africa and Latin America, until the late 18th century, followed by their economic decline and fall from the period 1820 to 1950. It analyzes the extent, the nature, the distribution of catch-up in terms of output, income, industrialization, and trade, which has been driven by rapid economic growth in the developing world since 1950, which gathered momentum from 1980 to 2010. This unfolding story, I believe, is important as it is beginning to change the balance of power in the world economy, and it could reshape the future. Thank you.
If there's one historian who can actually deal with such a long time scale, it's Professor Romila Thapar. May I invite her to begin this discussion?
Professor Mehta and friends, delighted as I am to congratulate Professor Deepak Nayyar on this book, which I read in manuscript and have reread in print. I must confess that I still can't understand what I'm doing on this panel. I'm not an economist. I am not an economic historian of the modern period. And I'm most comfortable, undoubtedly, when I'm speaking about the BCs. So let me project myself from the BCs into the recent ADs, as it were, and see what I can do. I'm justifying my presence here by resort to a statement made by a French historian, Fernand Braudel, who said that every event in history has to be seen from 3 points of time. One is the immediate past, when the event has taken place. The other is the approximate past, the last 3 or 4 centuries that lead up to the event. And the third is what he called the longue durée, the long duration of many, many centuries, going back to the time when the landscape where the event was taking place was actually molded and formed. So I'm going to go back to the long duration. The opening question of the book is precisely what the inquisitive historian should ask. Until the 18th century, what we today call the developing world, that is Asia, Africa, and Latin America, had economies much in advance of Europe. But by the 20th century, this was reversed. So the question is, why did this happen? How then will the developing world of today catch up with the developed world and its economic advance? The book struck me as being a bold sweep, cutting large swathes of time and space. It is indeed truly universal in its concept. It's lucid, it's lively, it's insightful, and it discusses this question with an immense understanding of the global perspective of the question. I would like to focus briefly on the prelude to the main study and to go back to the approximate past and the long duration. And the question that arises is economic growth, when seen historically, a kind of permanent seesaw, except that those sitting on the seesaw are constantly changing. Some people are sitting when one end is down and then the other end is up and so on. The opening chapters of the book refer to the economic destinies of the developed and the developing worlds in terms of what we now regard as the rich and the poor. So, as Deepak said, how far back in time does this dichotomy go? It's been a continuous differentiation that has existed historically since the start of civilization. The rich empires of Mesopotamia, Persia, India, China had the poorer Central Asian steppes and grasslands to the north on their borders. The Egyptians had the Sahara to the south, and the Roman Empire had what they called the barbaric tribes of barren territories from northern Europe. The rich areas of past times had characteristics which were very different from the ones that we have begun to associate with the later period of capitalism and colonialism. The epicenters were in non-temperate climates. The technology was not advanced enough to alter the environment. Poverty was not a political issue. The nature of early trade was strikingly different. Exchange was between contiguous centers. It went from one center to the next in a chain, or as I prefer to call it, it was a kind of leapfrogging trade, very different from colonial trade. And as the book points out, Deepak mentions that it was largely a trade in natural products. Pepper from India went to Europe, horses from Arabia and Central Asia came to India. And then most you get some crafted items like textiles and steel objects which go from China and India westwards. The kind of exchange ranged from barter to high-value coins, and the only monopoly that existed was the monopoly of the natural products. There on their own. And this was a trade that did not involve any migration of labor. All important differences which I think we should keep in mind. The striking change began in 1500 balance in favor of Europe in the 19th century, resulting from the profits of colonialism. He takes the argument further in saying that the significant difference was due to two other factors as well: for trade and investment, which, please remember, had been missing earlier, and naval support for maritime trade, also a feature that was new. This ended the leapfrogging trade and introduced what I like to call the pole vault trade. That is, the trader vaulted on a pole from Europe across to Africa or to Asia, cutting out all the little centers in between. The period from 1500 to 1820 introduces further changes. European trading companies in conflict with each other parcel out land, and suddenly what is very important is cartography. They lay out the map of the world as they then knew it, and they take up a ruler and a pencil and they draw lines and say, this is yours, and this is mine, and this is the third person's. The other big change that came at this time was migrant labor. There were huge areas that were opened up to settlement in Africa, in Australia, in Canada. Who was going to run them? Migrant labor was brought in by all the colonial powers. That's another major change at this time. All this raised the further question of the pattern of different patterns of colonialism. And I won't go into this here, but I will merely mention that I think that those who study the economy and sociology and history of colonialism should perhaps let us know what the difference was between, for example, Iberian colonialism and the relationship of Spain and Portugal to Latin America, and Northwestern European colonialism and the relationship of Britain, France, and Germany to Asia, because I think these were rather different. We should perhaps also look more closely at the experiment in the 20th century of trying to adapt and industrialize without the obvious forms of capitalism. The kind of experiment that was carried out in the socialist countries. And it's interesting to know why, in the context of their approach to industrialization, it seems not to have worked. What went wrong? In assessing the reasons for the falling back of Asia, Deepak's book refers to the older debates, of which there were many from the 19th century, on why capitalism and industrialization did not develop in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. What is commonly and popularly known in university circles as the transition debate. Very much something that is still being commented on. And mention is made in the book of the Eurocentric approach of people like Marx and Weber, who treated the non-European world as the other, and ipso facto assumed that whatever Europe had, the other did not have. There was a kind of positive-negative relationship, which was quite simplistic. This was replaced, of course, by much more down-to-earth factors that came to be suggested by historians like Morris Dobb, Brenner, North, and others, who were pointing to changes relating to factors like energy, the use of labor migration, land ownership and enclosures in Britain, new technologies, and such like. And then you got the environmentalists, Jareth Diamond, for example, who talked about capitalism only emerges in temperate climates, a very debatable thing. Or Guy Bois, for whom I have a lot of time, who talks about the crisis in European feudalism, which actually led to the emergence of capitalism, which crisis didn't take place in other parts of the world. One knows from the past that paradigm shifts in economy and technology are part of what we historians call the larger convergence of historical factors. In other words, to put it simply, there are many historical factors that seem to come together and act and react on each other that produce a massive historical change that we refer to as a paradigm shift. The convergence is one that is required for making the shift and also becomes the consequence of the shift. So it has a kind of dual role. Deepak's book discusses some aspects of this convergence, even while focusing on economic change. These are brought out in the discussion on the degree to which various countries are currently working towards the requirements of catch-up or partially actually achieving it. In this context, Deepak emphasizes what is usually given less attention, and this I think is a very interesting aspect of the later chapters of the book. That is that when the seesaw changes its position, it can create problems for the erstwhile rich countries, those that are in fact seated at the top. When the top begins to come down, it creates problems for them. In the same way as it creates new problems for those who are on the move up. It's not just a plain improvement or increase in economic wealth, there is much else that goes with it. Being rich or poor relates to other aspects as well, and Deepak writes of some of these, and in reading them I was also led to think of a few others as well. Today we live in the midst of the compulsion of the fittest surviving at any cost. It's the survival of the fittest, come what may. How is this to be changed to another kind of social ethic if we also want, as many of us do, the more equitable distribution of wealth and, very important, an access to social justice? And equally important, in India, we are endorsing today identity politics based on religious and caste identities. Should we not remember that the attempt to secularize society was an essential ideological term at the time when Europe modernized? But such questions, of course, they are important, but they go beyond the immediate concerns of the book. They're questions that one can talk about. Let me conclude then by returning to Fernand Braudel. Perhaps I am, after all, looking at Deepak's book from the perspective of the long duration. The perspective that the book provides is logical, historically reliable, and basically hopeful. It explains the challenge to those struggling, like we are doing, in trying to make it go, to make something of it. Obviously, we cannot repeat history as experienced by Europe or the United States, since the past is behind us, and the present is continuously moving, sometimes predictably and sometimes not. But we can at least move in ways that we can fathom, with an understanding of what we are experiencing and what the change is all about. And I think, therefore, my concluding remark would be that the great merit of this book, and it has an enormous amount of merit, but the great merit of the book is that it makes us understand that process of what we are experiencing and how to comprehend it.
May I invite Professor Amit Bhaduri?
Professor Mehta and friends, it's a great occasion, and it's a joyous occasion for me because Deepak has finally written a book which we had occasionally talked about quite some time ago, off and on, and I actually dropped out. I got interested in other things, so I'm glad to see that he has written a book of a kind of erudition which I certainly could not have matched. Now, before I start my appreciation and some comments about the book, let me start from a quotation which I found very apt for this. This is a quotation which, Albert Einstein had in his room in Princeton. And the quotation says, "Not everything that can be counted counts. Not everything that counts can be counted." Probably many of you know it. And this is exactly when you try to mix history with economics in the way you are talking about. This is exactly what happens. That you feel at the end that, there is, in normal language you say, countries are specific, experiences are specific, and at the same time there are broad movements of the type which is captured in the history of the movement. So, since we have very, according to the book, so what has been counted and what actually counts? What do you feel at the end of the book? That if you go by this dictum, then what is it that you get out of this exercise? I think one thing, of course, it's all everybody's personal predilection, everybody's personal angle to history and to economics and to society in general, but let me give mine very briefly. I think what you get out of this book is certainly a kind of periodization which is very different from the conventional one. It uses data, largely, put together by Deepak, also Madison and others, Baroque and so on. But basically what it does is to say that from about 1000 to 1500 AD, there was actually, as far as you can roughly see, the developing countries were, as a whole, had an important position in the world, much more important than what is today's called the developed world. Things began to change from 1500 in terms of world GDP and so on, from 1500 to 1800, 1820, whatever exact dates. This was a period when the change took place, and from 1820, Deepak says, what many historians have also said, is more or less the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, according to several people like Hobsbawm and so on. Now, this is also Deepak's mark, and you come up to about 1950, 1960, when the developing countries are completely down, and then you have a feature which is actually to some extent, in some sense, the gaps begin to close. And Deepak picks out 14 countries, mostly in terms of their industrial output, manufacturing output rather, in terms of their share, which he calls the next 14, a term which I think is too loaded because it predicts too much of history to my liking. But it says that it's the next 14 which are really have been doing much better. And while there is inequality between the rich and the poor world, or the developed and the underdeveloped, there is almost as much inequality, if you use some distance of measure, among the developing countries themselves. Probably in some cases more. And before I go into I would not go into the statistics, before I go into any further, also there is probably greater inequality in many cases, almost in several cases, within a country than outside. The rich and poor are different, but within a country, the rich, our gathering is probably more different than an average Indian. Now, this is which exists in the world. So inequality is very much a part, and there is a very good chapter in Deepak where he talks about population-weighted inequality, population-unweighted inequality, inequality among the people, whatever data we have and so on, let's say. Now, well, this is what you can count, and growth matters in terms of inclusiveness and so on, to what extent it deals with also distribution of income. Distribution co-evolves with output, which is obvious. Now there is one part, I think I'm speaking from memory, but somewhere on page 44, 45 and so on. There is one part which I found extremely interesting where he actually takes a plunge which I would have liked him to take a little bit more, to explain these long movements of history, that why developing countries did not were at a paramount better position till the 1500 or so, then went down, started going down, and then why from 1962 at least some of them came up. Now, if you take this very broad movement, there are three kinds of storytelling, conjecture, serious writing by historians and economists who make a profession and living out of it, and which is, the first is of course the Marxist one, that is, and the Asiatic mode of production, which he mentions without the name, that there was really not much of a movement in the so-called today's developing world was stagnating. In some sense, there was no dialectics. I think that's the term he uses. There is no dialectics and so on. The second, which is a little bit more, interesting, which Romila also mentioned in passing, Professor Thapar also mentioned in passing, that is the, basically, and it is highly fashionable in big American universities now, the influence of geography. The influence of geography, that is, in which latitude you are, so on and so forth, and Diamond is the one who started the whole thing. And the third is the catch-all institutions, which is also quite favorable, that if you cannot say anything, you say that it is the institutions which matter. And this is, of course, there is a third school. Now, you see, obviously when you pitch theory, conjecture, or whatever you like to call it, at that level you cannot either prove or contradict it. It's one of those classic non-provable statements of the Wittgensteinian style. You do not know, you cannot even decide what the statement actually is. But this is where the book is important. The book is important because at one level it allows you to have a better grip on these questions without, you will still have your prejudice, you will still have your dialectics, or you will still have your institutions or whatever, or your geography, but still I think it would be, people will be a bit more moderated if they go through the book. And this is what I mean by the basic value of the book, that is, it tells you that what you can count, which Deepak has counted hell of a lot in the book, with lots of tables and so on. All that you can count does not entirely explain very much. On the other hand, many things which you cannot count and you don't know the unknowable set, which actually very often counts quite a bit. Now, having said this, now let me say that probably he and I are not totally of the same way. You see, if you look at these things like institutions, if you look at technology, they are undisputable that they have worked, they have increased labor productivity. There's a very excellent discussion of the link between labor productivity and other, output growth and so on. But there is one element which I think is a question which I think was originally in a very fuzzy form, was put by Marx, so-called, between the forces and relations of production, but it comes back in a completely different way after reading the book, in my mind. You see very obviously, and I will say its relevance and stop. Obviously, if you think of technology, if you think of the kind of industrialization which is here, it is not only whether we are doing the same thing which the West did or which are not doing it, the sort of the Gandhian kind of debate. There is something much more important in this, and that is that what is the power which drives technology or industrialization? Or is it technology and the type of industrialization which you follow which drives social and economic power? I think this is a question which is of great importance. It has always been of great importance in history, And it is of great importance right now under our nose, because if you say, like I just heard Dr. Manmohan said 2 days ago, I mean, you should not be mentioned in a meeting like this, but still, that, you know, if you have high growth, you must have, with this goes corruption, you know, increase in corruption. Now, what you forgot to mention, if you have high corporate-led growth, you have a lot of corruption which the corporations can carry out. Now, I give this not for a political debate, but as an illustration of what I'm trying to say. That if you actually have, if you think that growth should be propelled or powered by corporations, you would have one kind of growth and one kind of thing will fail from it. If you do it the other way around, that I'll give and try to do the other way around, like say for example, you know, whatever it is, Gandhi, Swaraj, Mao's, you know, to every village, whatever it turned out to be, it did not work, but in each of these cases, there was an attempt to say that it is the power which will drive the nature of industrialization, the nature of technology and so on. And I think this is a question, the relationship between power and technology, power and nature of industrialization, which if I was writing a book like this, I would have much more obviously tried to face. Because I think this is a question which social science cannot answer, but certainly must make people aware of. That if you follow what we are following today, we will have a kind of growth, 10%, 5%, 2%, whatever it is, but it will have a certain kind of power relations which will go with this, and you will have exactly the opposite. You can have something quite different if you are conscious of this. And that there, so, you know, history, economics and so on, can serve a purpose. Thank you.
Mr. Dipankar Gupta.
Professor Mehta, my fellow panelists, who are also my friends, I hope they stay friends after all of this. It's not a good thing to do to a friend, really, to expose him to this kind of a gathering. But because I did with Deepak once earlier, I think it's returning the favor. At any rate, Deepak, I enjoyed reading your book very much. And what I really liked about the book was that it lit up certain parts of my brain which had been dormant for a very long time. And there are still many more parts left, by the way. So if you would like to write another book, I'm ready to read it again. The best way of commenting on your work, or indeed any work, is to misinterpret the scholar. Because Nietzsche said once that interpretation anybody can do, faithful anybody can do. But to misinterpret somebody is really an act of theoretical innovation. And I would therefore try my bit at misinterpreting Deepak, but not too far off the mark, because I don't want to be labeled as a complete eccentric. The fact of the matter is that when I first read the book Catch Up, in fact when I saw the title Catch Up, do you know what came to me? The first thought that came to me was, is Deepak a Maoist? Because Mao was the first one who said, we'll catch up with the West. And then I read closely and I found that Deepak's far was not, well, he was far from being a Maoist, but what he was drawing attention to was the fact that there's a great difference, as Professor Bhaduri also mentioned, between growth and development. In fact, there's a big difference between growth as such, of GDP and GDP per capita. And this is something that we all know about, and we argue about these things in our little workshops. But the way Deepak puts it across, broad canvas, as he said himself, is looking at the big picture, the really big picture. I think that that job is so well done that it really is difficult for me to misinterpret it as much as I would like to. There's, however, a bit of a problem that I have as a sociologist, by the way, and I don't want to be a joker in the back, but as a sociologist, there are certain issues that I would like to raise. First of all, I think Deepak is a very gentle person. He's a very gentle person because he has his enemies sagging on the ropes, and yet he doesn't deliver the knockout punch. What do I mean by that? See, Deepak has shown that it is not just growth. You have countries developing very rapidly. At the same time, you have a great divergence. There's not convergence at all. There is, of course, the recent scholarship in 2005, I think it was published by Aguillon with the convergence theory, and which took a bit of calendar into it. But Deepak is clearly not in that line of thinking, nor with Solow and Lewis who talk about steady state and stuff like that, a movement from low productivity to high productivity. The best part about Deepak's book is that he says there is nothing automatic about growth, right, Deepak? There's nothing nothing automatic about growth and nothing automatic about convergence. I think that is the most important thing. And he doesn't state this often enough. What Deepak states is wonderful, but what he understates is even better. And I think what he has done here is understated his major point. That is, you have something called the invisible hand of the market. We heard it so often, though I'm told Adam Smith only used it once. But we all use it, and it's become a kind of a metaphor. But Deepak has a better metaphor. The invisible hand of the that is in his book, and we can't be read right now. But one thing is, hands of the hand of the it doesn't really deliver the hands of the state. These issues come up episodically, fleetingly, and disappear. For example, education comes up twice in the book. Once in the index, but thrice in all. The contribution of the informal sector to the formal sector, then what do you find? From 1999 to 37.8%, by the time you go to 2004, when you finish the study, it is 46.6%. So in the high noon of liberalization, you have the growth of the informal sector invading the formal sector, and we are not paying attention to it. But Deepak does. When he says value added, I'm not so sure. I think that is a very important point. When Professor Bhaduri talked about corruption, this is it. Why is there so much corporate corruption? There's one thing to say that corporates are corrupt genetically, or politicians are corrupt, or whatever. And did you say Manmohan Singh said something? That was the last time I heard Manmohan Singh say anything. But if he said something, and he said this, then I think that he's got it all wrong. The reason why there's corporate corruption, primarily the logical reason why there's corporate corruption, and why it cannot be shaken off no matter how hard you try, it's a bug that's really got into you, and that is because of informal labor. If there's so much informal labor and you're plugging into informal labor, you'd be a fool not to do it if you have a bunch of money which you want to use as capital. You're going to use it. It's out there. And it is this informal labor that we have not addressed enough in our politics, economics, and sociology. In fact, there's a way of being charmed by informal labor, saying, look at artisans, aren't they wonderful people? So I'm not saying that the underdeveloped world will so cannonball its way right through and become developed overnight. But the hand of state that Deepak talks about, the visible hand of state that he talks about, that is something that we must pay attention to. And I would really like Deepak to write another book as an act of friendship in which he pays more attention to the visible hand of the state. Thank you.
So it is actually quite remarkable that without planning, people actually catch up with each other. Because I think one very powerful theme has emerged in this panel, and perhaps Mr. Nayyar will come back to it towards the end, which is this question of the visible hand of the state. But I mean, if I were just kind of make one remark on that and the function of that in the book, in a way, I mean, I think the difficulty of sort of conceptualizing that in the framework of the book will be as follows, which is, once you go down that road, right, and obviously I don't think anybody on this panel and this audience will in a sense deny the importance of the visible hand of the state, and it's very powerfully argued in this book. You then end up with the question which Professor Bhaduri sort of posed in slightly different terms, which is that it is something about the basic organizational power of the state that actually drives the primary explanatory story in how things unfold, including the choices actually economies make. So you can think of crony capitalism two ways. You can think of crony capitalism as the organizational form of our state is such that the only way it kind of knows how to mobilize is through these sort of cracks and these sort of side deals. Or you can stand outside of this and say, look, this is a kind of decisionistic point where we can either choose this or either choose that. And often, and I think in this panel also, whenever we come to talk about the state, there is this interesting slippage. which even Marxists make actually, that there is a kind of decisionism point as if we are standing here and saying there are these three paths, if we took that path, we would end up there. And the question is that that decision point doesn't turn out to be quite that simple, right? And what is it that actually explains those organizational forms of the state that steer you in one direction or the other? Now, my own sense is that in the book, it's sort of, I mean, Professor Nayyar is very cautious, but I think that's in a sense the virtue of the book, which is, it does give an autonomous role to that, but I don't think it wants to actually say that we should look upon that variable in a kind of decisionist framework, as if the form of the state is something you can kind of pick out as an idea and implement it, or pick out as a decision point and say, oh my God, we made a mistake and why don't we go in this direction? So there is some momentum driving the choice of that organizational form. And perhaps we can return to what that might be in the discussion. There are lots of, it's a great audience, but lots of economists, historians, other people who know about this subject. So we'll just open up the discussion for a few comments from the floor. Many of you may not have had the chance to read the book, but I think you get the general sense of the theme of the book, and the panelists have posed such wonderful questions that it allows you to sort of engage with them. So just invite some comments, questions from the floor. And may I request you to brief so that we can collect as many as possible within a short time. Yes?
Would you consider Scandinavian countries as the example where you consider Scandinavian countries to be the right example where you have equity and growth and environmental concern and taking care of informal labor and per capita versus equality, not just GDP or even per capita, but actually the right opportunity for everybody. And considering it's an intemperate climate, I mean, would you say that this is a new historical phenomena with a sustainable basis?
Bhaduri, you refer to corporate governance. Do you think it's a state collaboration with this, or it's just they are taking undue advantage of the system of misgovernance? Corporate corruption, is it because of government or state collaboration, or it's a misgovernance?
In the context of what I understood from what Professor Thapar was talking about in terms of the seesaw of economic growth, it's a question to the panel at large. Do you think that some kind of inequality is necessary on the global scale for development in terms of the historical experience that we have seen? And in that sense, that a kind of a zero-sum game where countries develop necessarily at the cost of others. I mean, it's not a causal link, but it just so happens that that is what results. And in this regard, what would you say in terms of the visible hand of the state, in terms of what the kind of decisions that they take, that the state takes?
Okay, I noticed the term catch-up and a lot of talk about growth. And one thing I haven't seen, and I think it has to be on the cards for the future, is a notion of a world where a certain amount of cooling off has to happen, because growth has been just explosive. And after that, then what? I mean, isn't there to be a questioning of the paradigm which only talks about growth? I haven't read the book. It's possible that he has talked in this way, but that at some point we are envisaging another kind of future where we cool off and age a little gracefully as a planet.
It's okay, I've not read the book, but Professor Nayyar, one of the most important, I think, events of the post-World War II world has been the beauty of inter-imperialist rivalry. between today's developed countries. Now, I cannot resist asking the question now, you do not see such a cooperation between developing countries of today, or you can say the most prominent developing countries, which I'm sure you must have talked about. So what do you have to say about that in the book?
Deepak, one question can I ask you? And you may have already covered it in your book, but while Romila was speaking, one thing that struck me was that why 1500 is a turning point and why you start at 1000. Seems to be that the generation of surpluses out of which trade came and capitalism was born really began with the capture of wind and water power, which took place in the 10th, 11th centuries. And because wind was most abundant in the north, the first place you got this was way up in the Hansa and the Hanseatic Sea, etc. Then, when you come to 1500, but until then, the sun was your sole source of energy, and therefore the actually production as well as industrial production was in the warm, tropical and warm temperate areas. Wind was the first. The other one that struck me, and I'm just asking you, whether you probably already covered this. 1500, you say, is a dividing point, but that's also the time when fossil fuels began to be used. And fossil fuels were and remain concentrated in the north. And what would you like to comment on that?
Again, I haven't read the book, but I was just wondering if colonialism figures in, because Romila mentioned 1820, and a little later we see the rise of colonial states. So I was wondering how that played out in your scheme of things.
It seems to me that there's a lot of there are all sorts of contradictions when we talk about the state, including many of the comments of the panelists. So on the one hand, we expect the state to deliver visibly health, education, and a whole bunch of other things. But at the same time, we are saying that the state is incapable of delivering. There's particular sorts of decisions it's taken, the kinds of coalitions it's formed with business and so on. So where does state capacity come in? How do we theorize about the state's capacity to deliver? How do we think about this historically? So it's really a wide canvas question, because we're talking about states, the same state at different points in time, in particular countries, but also we're talking about changes in state capacity over time. So possibly, where are we at now in the context of India?
But did you look at this middle income trap literature?
The last, okay. So, what I'll do is, in a sense, first invite the panel, and we have some time, and I think we find if the panel wants to take up the challenge to perhaps respond to any of the comments, that came not just from the audience, but actually from your co-panelists, because there may be interesting points, not just of tension, but if there are any other kind of points you'd like to make. And in particular, I think I was struck by one very powerful point Professor Thapar made about, and it came up in Amit Bhaduri's presentation as well, about the periodization of the story, because analytically what's interesting is not just a periodization by, in a sense, the share in the world economy, but in a sense, 1500 and kind of then post sort of 1700, the creation of a very different world system. In some senses where actually the fate of one economy becomes so crucially dependent on what happens elsewhere, right? Post-colonialism or after colonialism, in a sense, what analytically makes it different, right, is not just that there is a lot of economies and the world output of some is growing, But it is actually going at express. It is one world system in some senses because of the density of flows, whether of capital, whether of labor, in some senses, and so forth. And to that extent, it also has then implications for actually the role of the state as we actually think about it, right? Because the role of the state in a context where you have relatively, sort of, let's say, leapfrogging trade versus pole vaulting trade. These are two very different conceptions of world systems and how economies actually become interdependent on each other. And so is it the case that then that the character of the world system then actually shapes also the nature of the state, rather than again the state just being this sort of sui generis entity that takes decisions in isolation in context? And we were also hinting at that question. So I'll just invite, in a sense, the panelists to add any further reflections. They may not even be related to any of the questions, if there are any further thoughts on this. And then we'll give Professor Nayyar about 10 to 15 minutes to respond to questions and give his concluding thoughts.
Sorry, I'm not very good at thinking on my feet. I actually spend a lot of time sorting out my ideas. I think the periodization issue is very interesting. 1500 is, around 1500, not just 1500, but around there is important. Partly because the technological change that is taking place relates precisely to the volume of trade and the facility of transportation, steam navigation and the ships that go very much faster. The world becomes smaller, and the whole circumnavigation of the world that goes on at that time is symptomatic of this feeling of it's all within reach. And I think that that is a very important development that takes place certainly for the European countries who discover the world, as they put it, and for other countries that, in a sense, discover Europe. Nobody talks about how Asia was discovering Europe in this period, but Asia was discovering Europe in this period, precisely because in the previous times, if I can go back to my perhaps inept phrases, leapfrogging doesn't allow you to discover anything other than what is next door to you. And then it goes on and you hear stories. Somebody goes 4 degrees down and comes back with a story. But it is very much contiguous. It's very much something which is around you. Whereas the pole vault, of course, takes you into someone like Marco Polo, who they now say sat in Italy and invented his journey. Now, if this is true, that he sat in Italy and invented his journey, this seems to me very symbolic of the attitude that you feel the world is so close that you can sit there and sort of say, oh yes, this happens here and that happens there and so on. Unfortunately, we in China, periodization within the country, I think it's a question of really trying to assess whether the economy of a trade that comes from overseas is turning your own economy around. Now, for the VCs, again, one can say this very clearly, that you have Roman ships coming to Kerala and trading with Kerala, and they do turn the economy of Kerala around, that little part of Kerala. Whether you can say the same thing for the 16th century, with European trading ships coming in, which economies are they turning around? Surat perhaps, with the Dutch, the Portuguese, and then gradually the French and the English come in. It's a very slow process, and one doesn't know how much turning around is going on, because do remember that the difference between settler colonialism that I was talking about, where you take labor and plant it in a new area and start bringing in a new economy in that area. The difference between that and the traditional colonialism of the trading companies was that the trading companies continue very often the old economic and social structures. The East India Company took over the zamindari system. They didn't go in and say that this is feudal, this is terrible, this is non-bourgeois, we won't stand for it. They took it on and they continued with it for quite a while until it became economically not feasible, and then they gave it up. So I think on the question of periodization and its effect, one has to still see it very much in terms of which area, which region is affected. Perhaps it wasn't quite as global as one would like to believe that it was. The hand of the state, of course, is a very interesting question for those of us that deal with pre-modern periods of history, because we assume that the hand of the state was always there in a lot of things. I mean, the withdrawal of the state and the consciousness of what the hand of the state is doing is a modern phenomenon. For us, this is a given that the state is what is intervening. If not the state directly, then it is institutions and organizations that have the patronage of the state. Your schools and universities in Taxila and Nalanda and Burhanpur and so on are being financed by the state through a kind of religious patronage. The organization is there, but it is in fact being very, very closely monitored by the state. And there are many cases of religious organizations particularly playing a role in the politics of that time, which is really the hand of the state. One final comment on growth becoming explosive. I have just one question to ask. Growth for whom? Growth for some people is explosive, exclusive, and is doing all kinds of marvelous things. But for a hell of a lot of other people, there is no growth.
Perhaps you want to actually elaborate on the very powerful theoretical point you made about technology and power.
I don't think it's quite brief. I think the first is a question directed at me, which is about the corporate corruption. You see, like I will elaborate in a minute, it is not simply, it's a question of power. If you make anybody sufficiently powerful, whether it is a corporation or a communist party, without check or balance, you get very similar results. And you don't have to wait for Deepak's time scale. You get it within a few years. And I think that is the point I was mentioning. That is, you see, and in the broader historical sense, the way you come to power largely determines how you exercise it. So this is, I think, one of the few things I think is still a fairly valid generalization about history. That, if you come to power, if your growth, if your industrialization, whatever it is on the shoulder of corporations, then the way you will exercise power, even if you are a state, formally, democracy, whatever it is, capitalism, socialism, communism, I think it will show. And I think this is invariably true, everywhere. And this is what I meant, the jargon is path dependence, the path dependence of power. The second thing I wanted to say is actually about the link between the question which you had asked and many others asked. And I have a view in this. I don't know how many people support it or think it is plausible, that you see the state's capacity is, you are quite right, there is no way you can say this would be the capacity of the state and so on. I think I don't totally agree with Dipankar. That is, we have enough experience on both sides. The state sort of running amok and the state doing good things and so on. I think, this is a book which Deepak and I had read some time ago, when we had talked about the double movement. The check and balance, is Polanyi's check and balance between the state and the market, or two types of powers in institutions and so on. I think very sort of casually reading through quite a bit of literature and political theory and politics and by people involved in politics. I think basically what I have got out of it as a gist, well, got out of it meaning what I agree with basically, is you see there are three ways in which you can think of it. And in the Polanyi kind of way, that there is a giant state and the market grows and the market is controlled by the state, and then the state becomes too much and the powerful. The market controls it to some extent. He gives in many examples and so on. This is the sort of, if you like, the dialectics between the state and the market. And this is his idea of successful capitalist history. I think there is something else which is very important in our time. And this came from, well, I suppose a person it came from was Gramsci. But I think this is equally important. That is, basically, if you have a situation where the state and the market, for whatever reason, the corporates and the government, has collapsed into one, then where is the check and balance? We did not answer this question, and I think this is increasingly in many countries. And I think that to a certain extent, this was Gramsci's answer in the context of civil society and in the context of fascism in Italy, when he saw everything was collapsing and so on. His answer basically was, and which is probably a desperate answer, he was in jail, that if everything fails and there is a party which has taken over, then you have then you have to organize civil society without politics. And this is very often the case if all the dice are loaded against it. This would be my answer. So you see, there is nothing called the capacity of the state, independent of the context, very much like what Mr. Mehta was saying. This is the same kind of thing, that there is no straightforward way of saying, and there is no straightforward way of saying this will be the outcome of state intervention. It's completely unknowable. It will be this context of how the power balance and the checks are there. Well, on the question of limits to growth, I think one part is that, the inequality and so on, which we have talked about a little bit. And a question was raised, and just whether inequality is necessary for growth. Again, the answer is yes and no, just like the state. I mean, if you have a state which really depends on developing through inequality and transferring power in that sense, inequality is perfectly compatible with growth. There is no, wishful thinking that inequality is gone. There are plenty of examples in history. The opposite also equally true, that, all this lots of trash written in the form of econometrics and so on, the democracy is good. They mostly come out of Harvard, what do you call it? The business school, the Kennedy School. Hundreds of regressions and so on. The basic point is, nothing is better than Western style democracy. Just junk. I mean, it's just not true if you look at history. That is, and that will be the value of this kind of a book, that you don't get anything out of that kind of thing, except your preconceived notion is satisfied. I think what you really get about inequality in a certain way, quite fundamentally, is that how in the process of what I call the path dependence of the state's growth, inequality it can be handled by giving more power to one group, and then things will become more unequal and so on and so forth, or it can be done by trying to redress it by going the other way and equal things. On the question of environmental limited growth, I think very similar things are done. I mean, the poorest people in India today, Dantewada and so on, are precisely the people who are most tortured in various ways in the name of growth. And this is something which is unnecessary. Unnecessary, but it is necessary if you want growth to be corporate-led, so on and so forth, a particular part. You see, you can't take it out. Unlike in, you cannot compartmentalize it in the little things and so on. And Of course, you look at the natural resources as much as you can. I think I will stop now. Oh, one final thing, because I based it on the periodization of history. There is one sentence I want to say, please not, but it is there in Deepak's book, but not fully exploited. That is, you see, with this periodization, there was also a periodization of population. The relative, particularly the relative distribution of population. The population in the West, and there are a whole lot of Western historians who talked about this as population is driving growth and the agricultural practices and so on. And there is, and that periodization actually it is like an inverted U-shape, that it sort of flattens out and then it begins to rise sharply.
Thank you. Professor Gupta.
Thank you. This book, I think, would not have been written if Deepak were not concerned about democracy. This idea would not have struck Deepak at all. Neither would we be sitting here discussing growth and development, GDP and GDP per capita and the rest of it. So let us accept the fact. It is democracy that actually brings us here together to discuss an issue like this. And if it is democracy, then my view is very simple. In democracy, the future shines the light on the present. You have to think of the future, otherwise you cannot lead a democratic society. And you cannot throw up your hands and say, that's just too bad, we don't have what it takes, initial conditions are overbearing, and therefore let's just hang around and kick the can down the street and forget about it. You can't do it. And that is why I say that when you talk about the visible hand of the state, don't limit yourself to what this government has done and not done. Don't limit yourself to what the world has experienced during the Cold War, where there's a fight between capitalism and communism and democracy will go hand. These are the limitations of our history. But democracy takes a leap from history to return to it. This is, I would say, a good Marxist understanding of dialectics, if ever. And I do not think that anyone should be limited to the given, to the initial conditions, and therefore say that we just don't have what it takes is impossible. It's not true at all. A friend raised the question about Scandinavia. We can raise many other questions, but let me tell you this, that Scandinavia is Scandinavia because it was not limited by initial conditions. Scandinavia could do what it did because it saw the future and came back to the present. And if you're not going to do this, forget it. You'll never get democracy. You'll keep groveling, you'll keep complaining, you'll keep sniveling, but nothing's going to happen. Democracy is going to take a rest. And we're all going to get beaten by it. And therefore, the most important thing that we must accept is that with the kind of literature that Deepak brings to our attention, let us use it to further democracy instead of being, shamefaced about it. Somebody has said that, differences bring about development. This is a point I think Deepak contests very strongly in his book when he talks about Shenkrong. That is not true. So it is as if, we were all sleeping and somebody developed, let's catch up, it's a kind of neighbor's envy. But that is not how development and democracy happens. And I just cannot understand why we don't see this point. Nowhere in any democratic setup has things happened naturally. That happened because people have taken the initiative and done it. And the fact of the matter is that if there are conditions that go against you, it's your job to fight against the condition, to break the back of the condition. Otherwise, we don't deserve to be called democracy. I began this evening by raising some questions from Deepak's book. I end this evening by being more appreciative of Deepak and being at odds with my panelists. Thank you.
I will stand up so that people on this side of the room can see me. I must be brief, in part because time and patience are both exhaustible resources. And in part, that might be one way of getting you to read my book. I will make 4 points in bullet form. First, I think the periodization is important and the perspective is important. I think I have departed from conventional periodizations, and I have also attempted to tell the story about the evolution of the world economy from the perspective of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, rather than from the perspective of Europe. And in this periodization, the period from 1000 to 1500 witnesses some change, but that change is not significant. And in this period, Asia is overwhelmingly significant, but not dominant in the world economy. The period from 1500 to 1820 sees the beginnings of change. And they are associated with the voyages of discovery, the new worlds, the rise of naval and state power in Europe, and the spread of mercantile trade. That begins to change Europe. And 1820 to 1950 is the most dramatic transformation of the world in a short span of 130 years, in which two things happen. The first set dominate the period 1820 to 1870, which is the Industrial Revolution in Britain that spreads to Europe, and the revolution in transports and communication, the steamship, the railway, the telegraph, which shrink the world. And the period from 1870 to 1914, Hobsbawm's Age of Empire, where you have the politics of imperialism that imposes free trade on what we now call the developing world, and the economics of the transport revolution that dismantles barriers implicit in distance and time. So these countries deindustrialize. The second point I want to make is that monocausal explanations of why nations succeed or why nations fail are not just misleading, more often than not they are wrong. Certainly the people, Karl Marx as much as Max Weber, who believed that culture explained the rise of Europe and the fall of Asia, were wrong. But those who explain it in terms of geography alone, Jared Diamond, Ian Morris, those who explain it in terms of institutions in a very naive way, like Asomoglu and Robbins, they don't explain why countries that succeed get good institutions or why countries that fail get bad institutions. It is about, may I say, the specificities of conjuncture and space. That countries have succeeded and failed not because of one thing, but because of mix of things. And that's why you have to look for more complex explanations. The third, Dipankar lamented that while I talked about the visible hand of the state, it was not enough. Now, at one level, it is true. I argue in the context of industrialization that it is not about getting prices right, it's about getting state intervention right. And sometimes it's even about getting prices wrong. However, that is a more limited context in which the state plays a critical role in providing and creating initial conditions, in developing, enabling institutions, and in discovering supportive governments. But I agree with Amit that in a sense, the state and the market are not substitutes, they are complements. The nations that succeed find the right mix. I also agree with Dipankar that in a sense, these checks and balances that Amit and I have always emphasized are driven by political democracy. Because the politics of democracy exercise a check and a balance on the economics of markets. But in the book I make a subtle distinction, perhaps not loudly enough, that even in the countries that have succeeded, it is not that, there are countries that have relied a lot more on markets and openness, and there are other countries that have relied a lot more on the state and on intervention or calibrated openness. But those that rely on market and openness have sought to minimize government failure. Those that have sought to rely on the state and on calibrated openness have sought to minimize market failure. But in both cases, countries that succeed are the ones that create control mechanisms which actually preempt either the state or the market from going berserk. And that's really, I think, what Amit and Dipankar both seem to be suggesting. The fourth bullet, that, I think the central thesis and conclusion in the book is that growth is necessary but not sufficient. Growth matters, but it does not transform into meaningful development in terms of improving the living conditions of people. Indeed, I go so far as to argue, and that's the closure, to say that the countries which appear to be succeeding can sustain economic growth and the catch-up process if and only if their growth includes ordinary people. So that economic growth moves in tandem with social progress and human development. You're quite right, I don't discuss education enough. I don't discuss health enough, although I do argue that education is critical in this process. Now, there are many questions that people asked here. If you were to read the book, you would find an answer. That the Nordic model is not a model, that we have to look at context, at specificity. That, inequality and equality can both make for economic growth, but not for development. That the possibilities of cooperation amongst developing countries at the moment seem much more limited than the kind of coordination we saw among imperial powers. I don't believe, Prem, that 11th century was a turning point. You can read the book, we can discuss it. I believe the capacity of the state matters, but what shapes that capacity varies enormously across time and space. Yes, indeed, there is a middle-income trap, but it's not deterministic. There are ways forward. But if we don't introduce the corrective, like without the spread of education in society, there will be no demographic dividend in India. So let me, as I said at the beginning, I must be brief in the hope that you will read the book, but you will find answers to most of the questions that were raised. They may or may not be answers that you agree with. They may or may not be, in your view, complete answers. Now, I must say I have learned a great deal from what everyone on this panel has said. And if I had heard it before I wrote the book, I might have written a better book. The only thing I want to say in my defense is that fools rush in where angels fear to tread. I've attempted to do all this in 185 pages. I think readable pages. But I could have done a much better job. I agree with Amit that the question of what shapes technology, what shapes institutions, what determines the nature of the state are critical. But then I might have written either one book of 1,000 pages or a book in 3 volumes of 350 pages each. And I think very, very few people would have read that. Now, that's neither an excuse nor an explanation, but I hope reason enough for you to read the book. Thank you.
I'd just like to end by thanking, first of all the panelists, Professor Romila, Thapar, Amit, Bhaduri, and Dipankar, Gupta, for really doing an extraordinary job of not just engaging with the book, but themselves opening up so many interesting questions. But most of all, to Professor Deepak Nayyar for, there is a lot, he's being modest about what's in the book. It is an extraordinary achievement, and we'd like to congratulate and thank you for it. Thanks.